The silence that nearly broke her. What if I told you that a single broken piece of jewelry could unlock 23 years of buried trauma? What if that same necklace would become the key to freedom? This isn't just another story about overcoming adversity. This is about a woman who lost her voice at 8 years old and spent over 2 decades learning how to scream again. If you've ever felt trapped by secrets too heavy to carry, if you've ever wondered whether healing is really possible, then you need to hear what happened next. The morning light filtered through sheer curtains in ways that should have felt peaceful. Should have. But peace was a foreign concept in Sarah Chen's world, especially on what was supposed to be the most magical morning of her life. Tomorrow, she would walk down an aisle decorated with white peonies and baby's breath. Tomorrow, she would promise forever to the man who had held her through countless sleepless nights. Tomorrow was supposed to be perfect. But today she sat frozen at her vanity, staring at a delicate gold chain that lay broken in her trembling palm. 2 pieces of metal that had somehow survived 23 years in a forgotten jewelry box. 2 pieces that were about to shatter everything she thought she knew about herself. The necklace had fallen out when she'd been searching for her grandmother's pearl earrings. Such a simple accident. Such devastating consequences. Because the moment her fingers touched that familiar weight, her body remembered what her mind had fought so hard to forget. Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the mirror. Flawless makeup. Hair styled in romantic waves. Every inch the blushing bride. But underneath that carefully constructed image lived a truth so dark, so buried, that even thinking about it made her chest constrict with panic. She had tried again last night. The 3rd attempt in 2 weeks. Soft music, dim lighting, the silk negligee that usually made Marcus smile with that gentle hunger she had learned to both crave and fear. She had wanted it to work this time. Needed it to work. Their wedding was less than 24 hours away. But the moment his hands had moved across her skin, something inside her had snapped. Not broke. Snapped. Like a rubber band stretched beyond its limit. Her muscles had locked. Her breathing had turned shallow and desperate. The room had started spinning as terror flooded her nervous system. Marcus had pulled away immediately. He always did. His face had crumpled with that familiar mixture of confusion and hurt, though he tried so hard to hide it. "It's okay," he had whispered, but they both knew it wasn't. Nothing about this was okay. He had left the room quietly, saying he needed some air. And Sarah had been alone again with a secret that was slowly destroying the one relationship that meant everything to her. Now, holding this broken necklace, she finally understood why her body had declared war on love itself. The word had first appeared on her laptop screen during one of those desperate 3 a.m. Google searches. Vaginismus. 8 syllables that explained everything and nothing. Medical websites described it in clinical terms: involuntary muscle spasms, pain during penetration, often trauma-related. But those sterile descriptions couldn't capture what it actually felt like to live in a body that had forgotten how to trust. Sarah had printed out articles, highlighted symptoms, even found online support groups. But reading about healing and actually doing it, those were 2 entirely different universes. She remembered the first time it had happened with Marcus. They'd been dating for 6 months. He'd planned this perfect weekend getaway to a cabin in the mountains. They'd hiked during the day, cooked dinner together, sat by the fire sharing stories about their childhoods. When he'd leaned in to kiss her that night, everything had felt right. Natural. Safe. Until it wasn't. The panic had risen like a tsunami, drowning rational thought. Her body had turned to stone. Marcus had pulled back so fast, his eyes wide with concern. "Did I hurt you? What's wrong?" She had lied. Smiled through the tears and told him it was just nerves. First-time jitters. He had believed her because he wanted to. Because the alternative was too complicated to consider. But the episodes kept happening. Not every time, which somehow made it worse. Just often enough to keep them both walking on eggshells around their own intimacy. Sarah had thrown herself into finding solutions. She'd read every book on female sexuality she could find. Downloaded meditation apps. Bought expensive candles and massage oils. She'd even seen a therapist for a few sessions, though she'd never quite found the courage to say the real words out loud. Dr. Martinez had been kind but persistent. "When did your body stop feeling like a safe place?" she had asked during their third session. Sarah hadn't known how to answer. She'd always assumed some people were just born anxious, born broken. The idea that her body was trying to protect her from something specific, that felt too scary to consider. So she had quit therapy and doubled down on wedding planning instead. Flowers, venues, dress fittings, cake tastings. All the beautiful distractions that kept her from looking too closely at the cracks in her foundation. Marcus had tried to be understanding. He really had. But she could see the toll it was taking on him. The way he hesitated before reaching for her hand. The careful distance he maintained even when they were lying in the same bed. The growing silence between them that felt more dangerous than any argument. Sometimes she caught him staring out the window with an expression she couldn't quite read. Resignation, maybe. Or grief for the relationship they both wanted but couldn't seem to create. And now, less than 24 hours before their wedding, Sarah was holding the piece of evidence that might explain everything. This necklace that had once made her feel special. This gift from someone she had trusted. This beautiful thing that had become a symbol of something unspeakable. Her hands shook as she set the broken chain on the vanity. Outside, she could hear neighbors starting their Saturday routines. Lawn mowers humming. Children laughing in a nearby yard. The ordinary sounds of people living ordinary lives. How did they do it? How did they move through the world without this constant weight pressing down on their chests? Without checking and rechecking locks, without startling at unexpected touch, without carrying secrets so heavy they bent your spine? Sarah closed her eyes and let herself remember what she had spent 2 decades trying to forget. The apartment they'd lived in when she was 8 had been small but filled with light. Her mother worked long hours at the hospital, often pulling double shifts to make ends meet after the divorce. Sarah had learned to be self-sufficient early. Make her own snacks. Do her homework without being asked. Keep the TV volume low so it wouldn't bother the neighbors. Sometimes her mother's friend would stop by to check on her. Uncle David, though he wasn't really her uncle. Just one of those family friends who gets an honorary title. He was tall and loud and always brought her little gifts. Candy bars. Coloring books. Once, a stuffed elephant she'd admired at the store. At first, she'd looked forward to his visits. He made her laugh. He paid attention to her in ways that felt special, important. When he complimented her drawings or remembered details about her school day, it filled something inside her that she hadn't even realized was empty. But then the visits changed. Subtle at first. The way his hand lingered when he helped her reach something high. The comments about how pretty she was getting. The games that made her stomach twist with confusion. "This is just between us, sweetheart," he had said one afternoon, his voice different than usual. Quieter. Some things are too special to share with other people. Even now, 23 years later, Sarah could remember the exact texture of the couch cushions under her fingers. The way the afternoon sun slanted through the blinds. The cartoon playing on the TV that she'd tried so hard to focus on instead of what was happening to her body. She had tried to tell her mother. Not everything, because she didn't have words for everything. But she'd said Uncle David made her feel weird. That she didn't like being alone with him. Her mother had been folding laundry, tired from another long shift. She'd barely looked up. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. David's been nothing but helpful to us. You need to be grateful, not difficult." That was the moment Sarah learned that some truths were too dangerous to speak out loud. Some realities were too inconvenient to acknowledge. So she had swallowed her words and smiled when he visited and pretended that the crawling feeling under her skin was just imagination. The necklace had been his last gift to her. A delicate gold chain with a tiny heart pendant. "For my special girl," he had said, fastening it around her neck with fingers that smelled like cigarettes and cologne. She had worn it every day for weeks, even to bed. Not because she loved it, but because taking it off felt like breaking some unspoken rule. Like admitting that something was wrong when everyone around her insisted everything was fine. It had broken during a playground accident when she was running too fast and caught the chain on a fence. She'd cried harder over that necklace than she had over scraped knees or hurt feelings. Not because she missed it, but because losing it felt like losing the last piece of evidence that any of it had been real. Now, staring at those same broken links, Sarah finally understood what her 8-year-old body had been trying to tell her. This wasn't her fault. This wasn't something wrong with her. This was something that had been done to her. And her body, in its infinite wisdom, had never stopped trying to protect her from it happening again. She picked up her phone with trembling fingers and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in months. Dr. Martinez answered on the second ring. Dr. Martinez? It's Sarah Chen. I think I'm ready to talk about what really happened. The silence on the other end wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of patience, of the kind of presence that made honesty possible. I'm proud of you for calling, Dr. Martinez said gently. When would you like to come in? Now, Sarah whispered. I need to come in right now. Because tomorrow she was supposed to promise forever to a man who deserved the whole truth. And for the first time in 23 years, Sarah was ready to give it to him. The drive to Dr. Martinez's office felt like traveling through water. Everything moved slower, sounds became muffled, and Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd called Marcus and told him she had a last-minute appointment. He hadn't asked questions, bless him. Just said he'd handle the final wedding details and that he loved her. Those 3 words hit differently now. He loved her. But which version of her? The carefully curated one who smiled at dinner parties and never caused trouble? Or the messy, complicated, damaged one who was finally clawing her way to the surface? The waiting room was exactly as she remembered. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a small fountain trickling in the corner. The sound had annoyed her during her previous visits. Today, it felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to the present moment. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. She was the kind of woman who radiated calm competence, who could make you feel seen without making you feel judged. Sarah, she said warmly, I'm so glad you called. They settled into the familiar space of the therapy room. Sarah in the chair by the window, Dr. Martinez across from her with a legal pad that remained untouched on her lap. Between them stretched 23 years of silence and the promise of finally breaking it. Tell me about today, Dr. Martinez said. What changed? Sarah's fingers went automatically to her throat, to the space where a necklace had once rested. I found something. Something I'd hidden from myself for so long I almost believed it never existed. She told the story in fragments. The broken necklace. The memories that came flooding back. Uncle David and his special games. Her mother's dismissive words. The way her body had learned to freeze as a form of protection. Dr. Martinez listened without interruption, her face a study in professional compassion. When Sarah finally stopped talking, her throat raw from words that had been trapped for decades, the silence felt different. Not heavy with shame, but spacious with possibility. What you're describing, Dr. Martinez said carefully, is a normal response to an abnormal situation. Your body was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protecting you. But I'm 31 years old, Sarah said, tears starting to fall. Shouldn't I be over this by now? Shouldn't love be enough to fix it? Trauma doesn't follow a timeline, Dr. Martinez replied. And healing isn't about being over something. It's about integrating the experience so it doesn't control you anymore. They talked about the nervous system. About how a child's brain, unable to fight or flee, will sometimes choose to freeze as a last resort. About how that protective mechanism can persist long after the danger has passed, triggered by intimacy that should feel safe but instead registers as threat. Your body, Dr. Martinez explained, has been trying to tell you this story for 23 years. The panic attacks, the muscle tension, the inability to be fully present during intimate moments. These aren't flaws to be fixed. They're messages to be heard. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, not yet, but recognition. Like finally finding the key to a door she'd been trying to open her entire adult life. What happens now? She asked. Now, Dr. Martinez said with a small smile, we begin the real work. Not of erasing what happened, but of reclaiming your right to feel safe in your own body. They spent the next hour creating what Dr. Martinez called a safety plan. Ways Sarah could ground herself when panic rose. Breathing techniques that would signal to her nervous system that she was no longer in danger. And most importantly, strategies for having honest conversations with Marcus about what she was discovering about herself. "He deserves to know," Sarah said as their session was ending. "But I'm terrified he'll leave." "What if he doesn't?" Dr. Martinez asked. "What if love, real love, is actually strong enough to hold space for truth?" Sarah didn't have an answer for that. She'd spent so long believing she was unlovable in her broken state that the possibility of acceptance felt almost dangerous to consider. But as she drove home, the autumn sun painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber, she allowed herself to imagine it. What would it feel like to be known completely and loved anyway? What would it mean to stop performing happiness and start actually living it? Marcus was in the kitchen when she got home, surrounded by wedding favors and seating charts. He looked up as she walked in, and she could see him taking inventory of her face, checking for signs of whatever storm she'd been weathering. "How was your appointment?" he asked carefully. Sarah set her purse down and looked at this man who had waited so patiently for her to find her way to honesty. This man who deserved so much more than the half-truths and careful distances she'd been offering him. "Marcus," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." He put down the favor he'd been assembling and gave her his full attention. No phones, no distractions, just the kind of presence that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "I was hurt when I was a child," she began, "and my body has been trying to protect me from that hurt ever since. That's why I can't always be the way you deserve, the way I want to be." She told him about Uncle David, about her mother's failure to protect her, about the decades of silence and shame and self-blame. She watched his face carefully, looking for signs of judgment or disgust or the kind of pity that would be almost worse than rejection. Instead, she saw grief. Not for himself or their relationship, but for her. For the little girl who'd been betrayed by the very people who should have kept her safe. When she finished talking, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked over to where she was standing, stopping just close enough that she could feel his warmth without feeling trapped. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me with this." "You don't think I'm broken?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Marcus shook his head. "I think you're incredibly strong. I think you survived something terrible and you're still here, still fighting, still choosing love even when it's scary. That's not broken, Sarah. That's heroic." She started to cry then. Not the careful, controlled tears she'd learned to manage, but the ugly, cathartic sobs of someone finally allowing themselves to grieve what they'd lost. Marcus didn't try to hush her or fix her pain. He just stood there, solid and patient, until she was ready to let him hold her. And when she finally stepped into his arms, her body didn't freeze. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt safe enough to stay present in her own skin. "What does this mean for tomorrow?" she asked when the storm of crying had passed. "For the wedding." Marcus pulled back just enough to look at her face. "It means we're getting married with the whole truth between us. It means we're starting our life together from a place of honesty instead of hiding. I can't think of a better foundation than that." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind, but the quiet, steady certainty that healing was possible. That love, real love, could coexist with trauma. That she didn't have to choose between safety and intimacy after all. The wedding was beautiful in ways Sarah had never allowed herself to imagine. Not because everything went perfectly according to plan, but because she was finally present for it. Really, truly present. She had spent the morning getting ready with her bridesmaids, but instead of the anxious perfectionism that usually consumed her, she found herself laughing at their terrible jokes and actually tasting the mimosas they kept pressing into her hands. Her mother had flown in from Seattle, their first face-to-face meeting since Sarah had called her 2 weeks earlier to share what she'd remembered. That conversation hadn't gone well. Denials, accusations, the kind of gaslighting that had kept Sarah silent for decades. But today, as her mother helped her into her dress, there was something different in her eyes. "You look beautiful," her mother said quietly, fastening the tiny buttons at the back of the gown. "Thank you," Sarah replied, not because she felt obligated to, but because she actually meant it. They didn't have a big emotional reconciliation. Sarah wasn't sure they ever would. But there was an acknowledgement in the space between them, a recognition that truth had been spoken and received, even if it hadn't been welcomed. The ceremony was held in the garden of a small inn, surrounded by aspen trees that had turned brilliant gold in the October light. Sarah had chosen to walk down the aisle alone. Not because she didn't have anyone to give her away, but because she was finally ready to give herself. Marcus was waiting for her at the altar, and when their eyes met, she saw everything in his face. Love, yes, but also respect. Recognition. The kind of seeing that comes from real intimacy, built on truth instead of performance. They had written their own vows. Sarah's were short but powerful. Marcus, for so long I believed that love meant hiding the parts of myself that felt too complicated, too damaged, too much. You taught me that real love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up honestly, especially when it's hard. I promise to keep choosing truth, keep choosing healing, and keep choosing you, even when it scares me. Especially when it scares me. Marcus wiped away tears as he spoke his own vows. Sarah, you are the bravest person I know. Not because you never feel afraid, but because you feel the fear and choose love anyway. I promise to create a safe space for all of you. The strong parts and the scared parts, the healed parts and the parts that are still healing. You are not too much. You are exactly enough. When they kissed as husband and wife, Sarah's body stayed soft, stayed present. She could feel the autumn sun on her shoulders, smell the last roses of the season, hear the applause of the people who loved the most. She was here, really here, in her own life for the first time in decades. The reception was everything she'd dreamed of. Good food, terrible dancing, speeches that made everyone cry and laugh in equal measure. But the moment that would stay with her forever came late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and she and Marcus were slow dancing under string lights that twinkled like stars. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low and warm against her ear. "Present," she said, surprised by her own answer. "I feel present." It was such a simple thing, presence. But for someone who had spent most of her life dissociated from her own experience, it felt like a miracle. That night, in their hotel room, they made love for the first time. Really made love, with Sarah fully inhabiting her body instead of watching from somewhere outside it. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when old fears surfaced, when her breathing went shallow and Marcus had to remind her that she was safe. But she stayed. She didn't leave her body, didn't shut down, didn't disappear into the ceiling fan the way she had learned to do as a child. She remained present for her own pleasure, her own joy, her own capacity for intimacy. Afterward, as they lay tangled in hotel sheets, Sarah traced patterns on Marcus's chest and marveled at the simple miracle of skin that didn't flinch, muscles that stayed soft, a nervous system that had finally learned the difference between past and present. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied. "All of you." And for the first time, Sarah believed him. The months that followed weren't easy. Healing, as Dr. Martinez had warned her, wasn't linear. There were setbacks, difficult sessions, days when the old patterns felt stronger than the new ones she was trying to create. Sarah continued therapy, but now she was doing the deeper work. EMDR to process the traumatic memories. Somatic therapy to reconnect with her body. Couples counseling with Marcus to learn how to navigate intimacy with honesty instead of performance. She started a support group for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. The first meeting terrified her, but hearing other women's stories helped her understand that she wasn't alone in her struggle, and she wasn't uniquely broken. She also started writing. Not for publication, not for anyone else, but for herself. Stories about the little girl she used to be. Letters to her younger self. Angry screeds about the adults who had failed to protect her. Gratitude lists for the people who had helped her heal. The writing became a way of reclaiming her voice, of taking up space with her story instead of shrinking to make others comfortable. Her relationship with her mother remained complicated. There were phone calls where they actually talked about real things, and phone calls where her mother retreated into denial and blame. Sarah learned to have boundaries, to end conversations that became toxic, to offer forgiveness on her own terms instead of for her mother's comfort. She never confronted Uncle David directly. He had died 3 years earlier, taking his secrets with him. But she wrote him letters anyway, expressing all the rage and hurt and confusion that 8-year-old Sarah had never been allowed to voice. The most surprising part of her healing journey was discovering joy. Real joy, not the performance of happiness she had perfected, but the deep wellspring of pleasure that comes from being fully alive in your own experience. She started taking dance classes, something she'd loved as a child but had given up after the abuse began. At first, moving her body intentionally felt foreign, almost dangerous. But slowly, she learned to trust the wisdom of her hips, the power of her legs, the expressiveness of her arms. She and Marcus traveled, real adventures where Sarah didn't spend the whole time managing anxiety. They hiked in the Rocky Mountains, ate their way through New Orleans, spent a week in a cabin in Maine where the only sounds were waves and seagulls and their own laughter. They talked about having children someday. Not right away, but eventually. The idea that she could be a mother, could protect someone the way she hadn't been protected, filled her with a fierce determination. "I want to break the cycle," she told Dr. Martinez during one session. "I want to create something different." "You already have," Dr. Martinez replied. "Every day you choose healing over hiding, you're creating something different. Every time you speak your truth, you're modeling courage. The children in your life, whether they're your own biological children or not, will grow up knowing that silence isn't the only option." Sarah thought about that conversation often. She thought about all the ways her healing rippled outward, touching not just her own life but the lives of everyone around her. Marcus was different too, more confident in his ability to love someone completely. Her friendships deepened as she showed up more authentically. Even her work improved as she stopped trying to be perfect and started being real. One day, almost a year after the wedding, Sarah found herself back at the jewelry store where she had taken the broken necklace. Not to repair it this time, but to have it melted down and made into something new. "What were you thinking?" the jeweler asked. Sarah smiled. "A phoenix," she said. "Something that rises from ashes." 3 weeks later, she wore the new pendant to her college reunion. A small gold phoenix, simple but strong, rising from flames that looked almost like wings. Several classmates commented on it, how unusual it was, how beautiful. "Thank you," Sarah said each time, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the pendant. "It's a reminder that we can transform the worst things that happen to us into sources of strength." One woman, someone Sarah barely remembered from their freshman dorm, pulled her aside later in the evening. "I heard what you said about your necklace," she said quietly. "About transformation. I think I need to hear more about that. I've been carrying some things." They talked until long after the reunion officially ended. Sarah shared her story, not all the details, but enough to let this woman know she wasn't alone. Before they parted ways, Sarah gave her Dr. Martinez's contact information. "Healing is possible," she said. "It's hard work, but it's possible. You deserve to be free." Driving home that night, Sarah thought about all the conversations like that one. The woman at the coffee shop who had recognized something in Sarah's eyes and asked if she knew any good therapists. The teenager at the support group who had never heard the word vaginismus before and cried with relief at finally having a name for her experience. The friend who had confessed her own history of abuse after seeing how freely Sarah talked about hers. Every time she spoke her truth, she was giving other people permission to speak theirs. Every time she chose healing over hiding, she was creating space for others to do the same. That was the gift that came from surviving. Not just the personal freedom, though that was precious, but the ability to be a lighthouse for others still lost in the storm. Sarah was no longer the woman who had sat in a bridal suite, holding a broken necklace and wondering if she was too damaged to love. She was someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side, scarred but not destroyed, wounded but not broken. She was a survivor who had learned to thrive. And every day, in small ways and large ones, she was helping others find their way to the same kind of freedom. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the kitchen windows as Sarah chopped vegetables for dinner. It was a Tuesday, nothing special, but she had learned to find magic in ordinary moments. The weight of the knife in her hand. The sharp sweetness of the onions. The sound of Marcus's key in the front door. "Smells amazing in here," he called out, dropping his briefcase and hanging up his jacket with the kind of ritual comfort that comes from shared life. Sarah smiled as he wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. 2 years ago, that kind of surprise contact would have made her flinch. Now, her body melted into his warmth. "How was your session?" he asked, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Good," she said, leaning back against his chest. "Hard, but good." She had graduated from weekly therapy to bi-weekly, then monthly. Now she saw Dr. Martinez only when something specific came up that needed processing. The work was never really finished, she had learned, but it became easier to manage. Today's session had been about forgiveness. Not the quick, shallow kind that people often demand from survivors, but the deep, complex process of releasing resentment for her own healing rather than for anyone else's comfort. "I think I'm finally ready to forgive my mother," she told Marcus as they moved around the kitchen together in the choreographed dance of couple who had learned each other's rhythms. "Not because she deserves it, but because I'm tired of carrying that anger." Marcus nodded, understanding without needing explanation. He had learned the language of trauma recovery, had educated himself about the long arc of healing. He knew that forgiveness, for Sarah, wasn't about reconciliation or pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It was about freeing herself from the prison of perpetual rage. "What does that look like practically?" he asked, opening a bottle of wine and pouring 2 glasses. "I'm going to call her this weekend," Sarah said. "Tell her I forgive her for not protecting me. And then I'm going to set some new boundaries about what kinds of conversations I'm willing to have going forward." They had dinner on the back patio, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Sarah marveled at how comfortable silence had become between them. Not the terrible quiet of things unsaid, but the peaceful rest of 2 people who knew they were truly known. "I got a call today," Marcus said as they were clearing the dishes. "From that documentary filmmaker. She wants to interview you again." 6 months earlier, Sarah had participated in a documentary about childhood sexual abuse and its long-term effects. It had been terrifying to have her story captured on film, to know that strangers would hear the most vulnerable parts of her experience. But the response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of emails from survivors who had recognized themselves in her story. Mothers who had learned to listen more carefully to their children. Therapists who had shared the film with clients who felt alone in their struggles. "What does she want to talk about?" Sarah asked. "The healing process," Marcus said. "She wants to do a follow-up piece about what recovery actually looks like. The day-to-day reality, not just the dramatic breakthrough moments." Sarah considered this as she loaded the dishwasher. The first documentary had focused on the trauma itself, the stories of what had happened. But maybe there was value in showing what came after. The slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding. The setbacks and victories. The ordinary moments of joy that felt extraordinary when you had lived so long without them. "I'll think about it," she said. That night, as they got ready for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. Really saw herself, maybe for the first time in years. Not checking for flaws or critiquing imperfections, just witnessing this body that had carried her through so much. The body that had frozen to protect her as a child was the same body that now moved with confidence through the world. The nervous system that had once been stuck in perpetual alert was learning to rest. The heart that had closed itself off was opening wider every day. She touched the phoenix pendant at her throat, then let her fingers trace the path down to her chest, where her heart beat steady and strong. "Thank you," she whispered to her reflection. "Thank you for never giving up on me." Marcus appeared behind her in the mirror, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Just this," she said, gesturing to their reflection. "Us. How far we've come. How we almost didn't make it here." "But we did," he said, meeting her eyes in the glass. "We made it." Later, as they lay in bed, Sarah's head on Marcus's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow into the rhythm of approaching sleep, she let her mind wander to all the women who were still trapped in silence. Still carrying secrets that felt too heavy to bear. Still believing that healing was impossible. Tomorrow, she would call the documentary filmmaker back and say yes. Not because she enjoyed reliving her trauma, but because visibility mattered. Representation mattered. Seeing someone who looked like you, who had walked a similar path, who had found their way to the other side of unimaginable pain. That could be the difference between despair and hope. She thought about the letter she had received just last week from a college student who had seen the documentary. The girl had been abused by her stepfather for years and had never told anyone. But watching Sarah's story had given her the courage to report him, to seek therapy, to start the long journey toward reclaiming her life. "I didn't think people like us could get better," the girl had written. "Thank you for showing me that survival is just the beginning." That was the real gift of healing, Sarah realized. Not just personal freedom, but the ability to light the way for others still stumbling in the dark. She pressed a soft kiss to Marcus's chest, feeling grateful for this life she had never dared to dream possible. A life where love wasn't something to fear but something to cherish. Where her body was home instead of enemy territory. Where her voice was strong enough to speak truth, even when it trembled. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Healing wasn't a destination but a daily practice. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of someone who loved all of her, Sarah felt something she had spent most of her life believing was impossible. She felt peace. Real, lasting, bone-deep peace. And in that peace, she finally understood what Dr. Martinez had been trying to tell her all along. She wasn't broken. She had never been broken. She was a human being who had survived something terrible and come out the other side with scars that had become sources of strength. She was whole. She was enough. She was free. The morning sun filtering through their bedroom curtains felt like a blessing, and Sarah Chun woke up ready to meet whatever the day would bring. Ready to keep healing, keep growing, keep becoming the woman she was always meant to be. The woman who refused to be silenced. The woman who chose love over fear. The woman who knew, with absolute certainty, that her story was far from over. If this story stirred something inside you, you're not alone in whatever you're carrying. Maybe you've lived through your own silence. Maybe you love someone who has. Maybe you're just beginning to find your voice or helping someone else find theirs. But here's what I want you to understand above everything else. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community, in connection, in the brave act of reaching out when everything inside you wants to hide. 3 months after that second documentary aired, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small velvet pouch. The letter was from a woman named Maria, a survivor from across the country who had been watching Sarah's journey from afar. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I saw your documentary, both of them, and I wanted you to know that you saved my life. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, persistent way that hope saves people. I was planning to end my life the night I watched your first film. I had given up on the idea that things could get better. But seeing you talk about your healing journey, seeing you with your husband, seeing you laugh, it made me think that maybe I was giving up too soon. I started therapy the next week. It's been hard, harder than I thought possible, but I'm still here. I'm still fighting. And for the first time in 43 years, I told someone what my father did to me. In your second film, you mentioned that you had your abuser's necklace melted down and turned into a phoenix. I did something similar. I took my father's class ring, the one he used to hit me with, and had it made into this." Sarah opened the velvet pouch with trembling fingers. Inside was a small silver pendant in the shape of a tree, its branches reaching toward the sky, its roots running deep. "The jeweler asked me what it meant," Maria's letter continued. "I told her it meant that even after the worst storms, we can put down new roots. We can grow toward the light. We can become something beautiful. I'm sending this to you not because I think you need another piece of jewelry, but because I wanted you to have something that represents what your courage made possible in my life. Every tree starts as a seed that refuses to give up, even in the darkest soil. Thank you for refusing to give up. Thank you for showing me that survival isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. With more gratitude than I can express, Maria." Sarah read the letter 3 times before she could speak. When she finally found her voice, she called Marcus at work, sobbing so hard he could barely understand her. "What's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "Are you hurt?" "No," she managed between sobs. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Someone sent me a tree." That evening, they sat together on their couch as Sarah read Maria's letter aloud. By the time she finished, they were both crying. "This is why you keep telling your story," Marcus said, holding her close. "This is exactly why." Sarah wore Maria's tree pendant to her next support group meeting. When the other women asked about it, she shared Maria's letter, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "You know what this means," said Janet, a survivor who had been in the group for 2 years. "It means we're building something bigger than ourselves. Every time one of us speaks up, we're giving someone else permission to do the same." The group had grown from 6 women to 18 over the past year. Women of all ages, from all backgrounds, united by the common thread of survival. They met twice a month in a community center, sharing stories, resources, strategies for healing. Some nights they cried together. Some nights they raged together. And some nights they laughed until their sides ached, because joy reclaimed was the sweetest kind of rebellion against those who had tried to destroy them. Sarah had become an unofficial mentor in the group, not because she was further along in her healing than anyone else, but because she had learned to hold space for others' pain without trying to fix it. She had learned that sometimes the most healing thing you can do is simply witness someone else's truth. One evening, a new woman joined the group. She was barely 20, with scared eyes and hands that shook when she spoke. Her name was Emily, and she had just left her abusive boyfriend after 3 years of being told that no one would ever love her the way he did. "I don't know how to live without being afraid all the time," Emily whispered during her first sharing circle. "I don't know how to trust my own judgment about anything." Sarah looked at this young woman and saw herself at 8 years old, then at 18, then at 28. The details were different, but the core wound was the same: the belief that she was fundamentally unlovable, fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unsafe in the world. "You don't have to know how right now," Sarah said gently. "You just have to be willing to learn. And you don't have to learn alone." Over the following months, Sarah watched Emily slowly unfold. She saw her shoulders relax, heard her voice grow stronger, witnessed the moment when Emily laughed for the first time without immediately looking around to see if it was okay. Emily started college, got a part-time job, moved into her own apartment. Small victories that felt monumental when you understood how much courage they required. "I want to do what you do," Emily told Sarah one night after group. "I want to help other people the way you've helped me." "What do you think I do?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Emily thought for a moment. "You show people that healing is possible. Not easy, not fast, not pretty, but possible. You prove that we can survive the worst things and still build beautiful lives." Sarah felt her heart expand with something that might have been pride, if she had allowed herself such feelings. Not pride in her trauma, but pride in what she had done with it. How she had refused to let it define her, even as she honored its impact on her life. "You know," she said to Emily, "I think you're already doing that just by being here. Every time you show up to group, every time you share your story, every time you choose healing over hiding, you're showing someone else what's possible." That night, Sarah went home and found Marcus in his study, grading papers. He looked up as she entered, immediately sensing her emotional state. "Good meeting," he asked, closing his laptop and giving her his full attention. "There's something I want to do," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Something bigger than the support group, bigger than the documentaries." She told him about her conversation with Emily, about Maria's letter, about all the messages she had received from survivors who felt isolated and hopeless. "I want to start a foundation," she said. "Something that provides resources for survivors. Therapy scholarships, support groups, educational materials for families and friends. I want to create the kind of support system I wish I'd had when I was 21 and afraid to speak." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Tell me more." They stayed up until 3 in the morning, sketching out ideas on the back of his lesson plans. Sarah talked about trauma-informed therapy training for counselors in small towns where resources were scarce. About online support groups for survivors who couldn't access in-person meetings. About educational programs for parents and teachers who wanted to learn how to respond appropriately when children disclosed abuse. "We could call it the Phoenix Foundation," Marcus suggested. "Rising from the ashes." Sarah touched the phoenix pendant at her throat, thinking of Maria's tree, of all the symbols they had created to represent their transformation. "Yes," she said. "But not just rising. Flying." The next morning, Sarah called Dr. Martinez and asked if she would consider serving on the Foundation's advisory board. "I've been waiting for you to ask," Dr. Martinez said with a laugh. "I wondered when you'd realize that your healing journey was preparing you for something bigger than yourself." "What do you mean?" "Sarah, do you remember what you were like when you first came to see me? So afraid of taking up space that you could barely speak above a whisper? Look at you now. You're talking about starting a foundation, about amplifying other survivors' voices. That's not coincidence. That's purpose." Sarah felt something click into place, like a puzzle piece finding its home. All the pain, all the healing, all the slow, difficult work of rebuilding herself. It hadn't been just for her. It had been preparing her to help others do the same. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Good," Dr. Martinez said. "That means it matters." The Phoenix Foundation launched 6 months later with a small fundraising dinner in the community center where Sarah's support group met. 50 people attended, including several group members, Marcus's colleagues, and a handful of local therapists and social workers. Sarah had been nervous about speaking publicly about her work, but when she stood up to address the room, her voice was strong and clear. 2 years ago, she began, I believed that my trauma was something to hide, something to manage quietly, something that made me too broken for real love. Tonight, I'm standing before you as proof that healing is not only possible, it's powerful. Every survivor who finds their voice makes it easier for the next person to find theirs. Every person who breaks the silence chips away at the shame that keeps others trapped. We're not just healing ourselves. We're healing the world, one story at a time. The Foundation's first initiative was a scholarship program that provided free therapy to survivors who couldn't afford it otherwise. Within a year, they had funded treatment for 37 people across 3 states. Sarah also started a podcast called After the Silence, featuring conversations with survivors, therapists, advocates, and allies. The show grew slowly but steadily, reaching people in small towns and big cities, in countries where talking about sexual abuse was still taboo. Each episode ended the same way, with Sarah's voice saying, "You are not alone. You are not broken. You are worthy of healing. And your story, whatever it is, matters." The messages poured in from listeners around the world. A teenager in rural Montana who had never heard the word trauma before listening to the show. A grandmother in Ireland who finally found the courage to report her brother for what he had done to her 60 years earlier. A military veteran who realized that his childhood abuse was connected to his PTSD. "You're creating ripples," Marcus told her one evening as she read through listener emails. "Every person you reach reaches other people. It's exponential." Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she had been drafting a response to a woman who had written about leaving her abusive marriage after hearing Sarah's story. "Do you ever worry that I'm too focused on this work?" she asked. "That it's consuming too much of our life?" Marcus considered this seriously. He never dismissed her concerns, even when they seemed unfounded to him. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're doing exactly what you're meant to be doing. And I think our life is richer, not poorer, because you're living so purposefully." He was right, she realized. This work didn't drain her the way her old job had. It energized her, gave her a sense of meaning that she had never experienced before. Even the difficult parts, the triggering interviews or the heartbreaking emails, felt worthwhile because they were connected to something larger than herself. On their 3rd wedding anniversary, Marcus surprised Sarah with a trip to Hawaii. Not because they needed to escape her work, but because he wanted to celebrate how far they had both come. They spent a week on Maui, hiking through bamboo forests and swimming in hidden waterfalls. Sarah marveled at how present she could be, how fully she could inhabit her body without fear or dissociation. One evening, as they watched the sunset from their hotel balcony, Marcus pulled out a small wrapped box. "It's not our anniversary gift," he said quickly, seeing her surprised expression. "This is something else." Inside the box was a delicate gold bracelet with a small charm shaped like a microphone. "For the woman who found her voice," he said, fastening it around her wrist, "and uses it to help others find theirs." Sarah looked at the charm, then at her husband's face, soft with love and pride. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for this, but for waiting. For believing I was worth waiting for." "You were never not worth waiting for," he replied. "I just had to wait for you to believe it too." That night, they made love under the Hawaiian stars, and Sarah felt something she had never experienced before: complete integration. Her mind, body, and spirit were finally aligned, finally at peace with each other. When they returned home, Sarah threw herself back into her work with renewed energy. The Foundation had received a major grant that would allow them to expand their services. She was invited to speak at conferences, to consult with other organizations, to train therapists in trauma-informed care. But the work that meant the most to her was still the small, personal connections. The late-night phone calls with group members who were having panic attacks. The emails from listeners who were taking their first steps toward healing. The quiet conversations with strangers who recognized something in her eyes and asked if she knew where they could find help. One afternoon, Sarah was working in her home office when the doorbell rang. On her doorstep stood a young woman with familiar features, though Sarah couldn't place her. "Are you Sarah Chen?" the woman asked. "Yes. I'm Rebecca Martinez, Dr. Martinez's daughter. She told me about your work, and I was wondering if we could talk." Sarah invited Rebecca in, made tea, and listened as this young woman shared her story. Sexual assault in college. Years of silence. A recent breakdown that had finally driven her to seek help. "My mom says you run a support group," Rebecca said. "I was wondering if I could join." Sarah looked at this girl, probably no older than Emily had been when she first came to group, and felt the familiar tug of purpose. "Of course," she said. "We meet Tuesday nights at 7. But I want you to know something first." "What's that?" "You're not just joining a support group. You're joining a family. A family of women who refuse to be silenced, who choose healing over hiding, who believe that our stories can be sources of strength instead of shame." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "I want that," she whispered. "I want to be part of something like that." "Then you already are," Sarah said. That night, Sarah sat in her garden, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The phoenix pendant rested warm against her throat, and Maria's tree charm hung from a chain on her wrist, alongside Marcus's microphone charm. Each piece of jewelry told part of her story. The phoenix, rising from the ashes of her childhood trauma. The tree, growing from the seed of her courage to speak. The microphone, amplifying not just her voice but the voices of all the women who had been taught to stay quiet. Tomorrow there would be more work to do. More survivors to support, more stories to share, more silence to break. But tonight, Sarah simply sat with the miracle of her own life. The marriage that had survived her healing journey. The work that fed her soul. The community of survivors who had become her chosen family. She thought about 8-year-old Sarah. Frozen in fear, staring at a ceiling fan and counting rotations. She thought about 28-year-old Sarah, crying in a bridal suite while holding a broken necklace. And she thought about the woman she was now, at 35, confident in her own skin and committed to using her story to light the way for others. "We made it," she whispered to her younger selves. "We made it through." A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Sarah made a wish. Not for herself this time, but for all the survivors still trapped in silence. For all the children being hurt right now who needed someone to believe them. For all the adults carrying secrets that felt too heavy to bear. She wished for their voices to be heard, their pain to be acknowledged, their healing to begin. And then she went inside to her husband, to her life, to the beautiful ordinary miracle of being fully, finally, completely alive. The next morning brought an email that would change everything. It was from a television producer in New York who had seen both documentaries and listened to every episode of Sarah's podcast. "Dear Sarah," the email read, "My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm a producer for a major network morning show. We're putting together a special series on survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and we would love for you to be our featured expert. This would be a 5-part series, reaching potentially millions of viewers. Would you be interested in discussing this opportunity?" Sarah stared at the email for a full minute before calling Marcus at school. "They want me to be on national television," she said when he answered. "Millions of people, Marcus. Millions." "That's incredible," he said, though she could hear the concern in his voice. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But also excited? Like maybe this is the next step." They talked it through that evening over dinner. The exposure would be unprecedented, both the opportunity and the risk. National television meant national scrutiny, potential backlash, the loss of privacy that had protected her work so far. But it also meant reaching survivors in places where resources were non-existent. It meant normalizing conversations about trauma. It meant showing the world what healing actually looked like. "What does your gut tell you?" Marcus asked. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to her body, the same body that had once frozen in terror but had now learned to be her wisest counselor. "It tells me that fear is not always a reason to say no," she said. "Sometimes it's a reason to say yes." 3 months later, Sarah found herself in a New York studio, wearing her phoenix pendant and Maria's tree charm for courage. The host, a warm woman named Patricia, had done her homework and asked thoughtful questions about trauma, healing, and resilience. What would you say to someone who's watching right now and recognizing themselves in your story? Patricia asked during the live segment. Sarah looked directly into the camera, imagining all the survivors who might be watching from their living rooms, their bedrooms, their secret places of pain. I would say that your silence has protected you, but it doesn't have to define you, she said. I would say that what happened to you was not your fault, and that healing is possible even when it doesn't feel like it. And I would say that you are not alone, even when everything inside you insists that you are. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The network's website crashed from the volume of people trying to access the resources Sarah had mentioned. Her podcast downloads increased by 500% overnight. The foundation received more donations in 1 week than they had in their entire first year. But the messages that meant the most to Sarah were the personal ones. The emails from survivors who had never told anyone about their abuse but were finally ready to seek help. The phone calls from parents who were learning how to have difficult conversations with their children. The letters from therapists who were inspired to specialize in trauma work. You've started an avalanche, Dr. Martinez told her during one of their monthly check-ins. In the best possible way. Sarah laughed, remembering when Dr. Martinez had first used that metaphor years earlier. It feels more like a healing revolution. Maybe that's what we need, Dr. Martinez replied. Maybe the world is finally ready to listen. Over the following year, Sarah's platform continued to grow. She wrote a book about her healing journey that became a bestseller. She spoke at conferences around the world. The Phoenix Foundation expanded to serve survivors in 12 countries. But the work that still meant the most to her happened on Tuesday nights in that community center, with 18 women sitting in a circle, sharing their stories and witnessing each other's courage. Emily, the young woman who had joined the group 3 years earlier, was now co-facilitating meetings and studying to become a trauma therapist herself. Rebecca Martinez was leading a campus advocacy group at her university. Maria, the woman who had sent the tree pendant, had flown out to attend a group meeting and share her story in person. Look around this room, Sarah said during one particularly powerful meeting. 5 years ago, I sat in a therapist's office and couldn't say the word abuse out loud. Now look at us. Look at what we've built together. The women looked around the circle, seeing not victims but victors. Not broken people but people who had been broken and had chosen to heal. Not isolated survivors but a community of warriors who had turned their pain into purpose. We're changing the world, said Janet, the group's longest-running member. One story at a time. No, Sarah corrected gently. We're not changing the world. We're changing ourselves. And that's changing the world. That night, Sarah drove home through the familiar streets of her city, past the coffee shop where she'd first Googled Vaginismus, past the jewelry store where she'd had her necklace repaired, past the church where she and Marcus had gotten married. Each landmark told part of her story, but they no longer felt like markers of trauma. They felt like evidence of triumph, proof that it was possible to transform even the most painful experiences into sources of strength and service. At home, she found Marcus in their bedroom, reading in bed with their dog curled up beside him. 3 years earlier, they had adopted Luna from a rescue organization. She was a trauma survivor too, a golden retriever who had been abused and abandoned but had learned to trust again. How was group? Marcus asked, setting down his book as Sarah changed into pajamas. Good, she said, settling beside him and scratching Luna behind the ears. Rebecca shared for the first time about her assault. Really shared, not just the facts but the feelings. How was that for you to witness? Sarah considered this. Early in her healing journey, hearing other people's trauma stories had been triggering, overwhelming. Now it felt sacred, like being invited to witness someone's rebirth. It was an honor, she said. And it reminded me how far we've all come. Marcus kissed her forehead, and Sarah marveled again at how natural physical affection had become between them. Her body no longer braced for impact when he touched her. Instead, it softened into his warmth, grateful for the safety they had built together. I love you, she said, meaning it in ways she had never understood before. Not just romantic love, but the deep appreciation for someone who had seen her at her most broken and had chosen to stay. who had believed in her healing before she believed in it herself. "I love you too," he replied. "All of you. Always." As Sarah drifted off to sleep, Luna's warm weight across her feet and Marcus's steady breathing beside her, she thought about the 8-year-old girl who had once believed that silence was the only way to survive. That little girl had been right about one thing: she had survived. But she had been wrong about another. Silence hadn't been the only way. It had just been the beginning. The real survival had come later, in the courage to speak, in the willingness to be vulnerable, in the choice to transform her pain into purpose and her trauma into a gift she could offer others. Tomorrow would bring more work, more survivors to support, more opportunities to break the silence that kept people trapped in shame. But tonight, Sarah slept peacefully, knowing that her voice had found its home. Not in silence, but in the chorus of survivors who refused to be silenced. Not in hiding, but in the light that comes from living authentically. Not in isolation, but in the community of healing that grows stronger every time someone chooses truth over fear. The little girl who had once counted ceiling fan rotations to survive had grown into a woman who counted lives touched, voices found, and silences broken. And the count was still growing. If this story reached into your chest and touched something you've been carrying alone, please know this: you are not broken, you are not alone, and your healing matters more than you know. Every person who finds their voice makes it safer for someone else to find theirs. Every survivor who chooses healing over hiding creates space for others to do the same. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about your own journey or about someone you love who's walking this path. And remember that seeking help isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you can do. Because your story isn't over. Your voice matters. And somewhere out there, someone is waiting to hear that they're not the only one who has lived through the impossible and come out the other side. That's the power of breaking the silence. That's the magic of refusing to stay hidden. That's how we heal, not just ourselves, but the world.